of Damon Runyon is chief sports writer for a certain New York newspaper. He spends many years walking up and down Broadway, soaking up the atmosphere, and ends up writing many a great story set among the lowlife of New York. He writes about guys, dolls, dudes, malls, shysters, hustlers, crap shooters, speakeasies, and a certain sort of icing, which doesn't involve cakes. The tales take place at night or underground because, let's face it, New York takes place at night or underground. Tonight you'll get to hear the story of Lance McGowan and how he shares a glass of wine and a sandwich with a rich, daffy old lady one night in order to avoid Angie the Ox and a party from Brooklyn. A party which includes certain death.
Some Staten Island guys, in the interest of fair play, will haul off to the Lower East Side to make sure a party from over there winds up similarly tired.
Now it seems that one cold winter night, a party of residents of Brooklyn comes across the Manhattan Bridge in an automobile, wishing to pay a call on a guy by the name of Lance McGowan, who is well known to one and all along Broadway as a coming guy in the business world. In fact, it is generally conceded that, barring accident, Lance will someday be one of the biggest guys in this country as an importer, and especially as an importer of such merchandise as fine liquors, because he is very bright and has many good connections throughout the United States and Canada. Furthermore, Lance McGowan is a very nice-looking young guy and has plenty of ticker, although some citizens say he does not show very sound business judgment in trying to move in on Angie the Ox over in Brooklyn, as Angie the Ox is an importer himself, besides enjoying a splendid trade in other lines, including artichokes and extortion. Of course, Lance McGowan is not interested in artichokes at all, and very little in extortion, but he does not see any reason why he shall not place his imports in a thriving territory such as Brooklyn, especially as his line of merchandise is much superior to anything handled by Angie the Ox. Well, anyway, Angie is one of the residents of Brooklyn in the party that wishes to call on Lance McGowan. And besides Angie, the party includes a guy by the name of Marky Max, who is a very prominent character in Brooklyn, and another guy by the name of the Louse Kid, who's not so prominent, but is considered a very promising young guy in many respects. Although personally, I think the Louse Kid has a very weak face. He's supposed to be a wonderful hand with a burlap bag, when anybody wishes to put somebody in such a bag, which is considered a great practical joke in Brooklyn. And in fact, the Louse Kid has a burlap bag with him on the night in question, and they're figuring on putting Lance McGowan in the bag when they call on him, just for the laugh. Personally, I consider this a very crude form of humor. But then Angie the Ox and the other members of his party are very crude characters anyway. Well, it seems they have Lance McGowan pretty well cased. But they always know an evening, around towards 10 o'clock, he nearly always strolls through West 54th Street on his way to a certain spot on Park Avenue that is called the Hummingbird Club, which has a very high-toned clientele. And the reason Lance goes there is because he has a piece of the joint. And furthermore, he loves to show off his shape in a tuxedo to the swell dolls. So the citizens of Brooklyn drive in their automobile along this route, and as they roll past Lance McGowan, Angie the Ox and Monkey Max let fly at Lance with a couple of sawed-offs, while the louse kid holds the burlap bag, figuring, all I know, that Lance will be startled by the sawed-offs and will hop into the bag like a rabbit. But Lance is by no means a sucker. And when the first blast of the slugs from the sawed-offs breezes past him without hitting him, what does he do but hop over a brick wall alongside him and drop into a yard on the other side? So, the story really begins with Lance McGowan behind the brick wall, practically defenseless. And the reason I know this story is because Lance McGowan tells most of it to me. As Lance knows that I know his real name is Lancelot, and he feels under great obligation to me because I never mentioned the matter publicly. Now, the brick wall Lance hops over is a wall about a pretty fair-sized yard, and the yard belongs to an old two-story stone house. And this house is well known to one and all in this man's town as a house of great mystery, and it is pointed out as such by the drivers of sightseeing buses. This house belongs to an old doll by the name of Miss Abigail Arley. And anybody who ever reads the newspapers will tell you that Miss Abigail Arley has so many potatoes that it's really painful to think of. Especially to people who have no potatoes whatever. In fact, Miss Abigail Arley has practically all the potatoes in the world, except maybe a few left over for general circulation. These potatoes are left to her by her papa, old Waldo Arley, who accumulates same in the early days of this town by buying corner real estate very cheap before people realized this real estate would be quite valuable later for fruit juice stands and cigar stores. It seems that Waldo was a most eccentric old bloke and is very strict with his daughter and will never let her marry, or even as much as look as if she wishes to marry, until finally she is so old she does not care a cuss about marrying or anything else, and becomes very eccentric herself. In fact, Miss Abigail Arley becomes so eccentric that she cuts herself off from everybody, and especially from a lot of relatives who are wishing to live off her. And anytime anybody cuts themselves off from such characters, they are considered very eccentric indeed, especially by the relatives. She lives in the big house all alone, except for a couple of old servants, and it is very seldom that anybody sees her around and about, and many strange stories are told of her. Well, no sooner is he in the yard than Lance McGowan begins looking for a way to get out, and one way he does not wish to get out is over the wall again, because he figures Angie, the ox, and his sawed-offs are bound to be waiting for him in 54th Street. So Lance looks around to see if there's some way out of the yard in another direction, but it seems there is no such way. And pretty soon, he sees the snozzle of a sawed-off come poking over the wall with the ugly kisser of Angie the Ox behind it, looking for him. And there is Lance McGowan, all cornered up in the yard, and not feeling so good at that. Then Lance happens to try a door on one side of the house, and the door opens at once, and Lance McGowan hastens in to find himself in the living room of the house. It is a very large living room, with very nice furniture standing around and about, and oil paintings on the walls, and a big old grandfather's clock as high as the ceiling, and statuary here and there. In fact, it is such a nice, comfortable-looking room that Lance McGowan is greatly surprised, as he's expecting to find a regular mystery house room, such as you see in the movies, with cobwebs here and there and everything all rotted up, and maybe Boris Karloff wandering about making strange noises. But the only person in this room seems to be a little old doll who's all dressed up in soft white, who's sitting in a low rocking chair by an open fireplace in which a bright fire is going, doing some tatting. Well, naturally, Lance McGowan is somewhat startled by this scene, and he's figuring the best thing he can do is to guzzle the old doll before she can commence yelling for the gendarmes, when she looks up at him and gives him a soft smile and speaks to him in a soft voice as follows. "Good evening," the old doll says. Well, Lance cannot think of any reply to make to this at once, as it is certainly not a good evening for him. And he stands there looking at the old doll, somewhat dazed, when she smiles again and tells him to sit down. So the next thing Lance knows, he is sitting there in a chair in front of the fireplace chewing the fat with the old doll, as pleasant as you please. And of course, the old doll is nobody but Miss Abigail Ardsley. "You are young," the old doll says to Lance McGowan, looking him in the kisser. "It's many years since a young man comes through yonder door." "Ah, yes," she says. "So many years." And with this, she lets out a big sigh. It looks so very sad that Lance McGowan's heart is touched. 45 years now," the old doll says in a low voice, as if she's talking to herself. "So young, so handsome, and so good." And although Lance is in no mood to listen to reminiscences at this time, the next thing he knows, he's hearing a very pathetic love story, because it seems that Miss Abigail Ardsley is once all hotted up over a young guy who was nothing but a clerk in her papa's office. It seems from what Lance McGowan gathers that there's nothing wrong with the young guy that a million bobs will not cure. But Miss Abigail Ardsley's papa is a mean old waffle. He'll never listen to her having any truck with a poor guy, so they dast not let him know how much they love each other. But it seems that Miss Abigail Ardsley's ever-loving young guy has plenty of moxie, and every night he comes to see her after her papa goes to the hay, and she lets him in through the same side door Lance McGowan comes through, and they sit by the fire and hold hands, and talk in low tones, and plan what they will do when the young guy makes a scratch. Then one night, it seems Miss Abigail Ardsley's papa has the stomachache, or some such, and cannot sleep a wink. So he comes wandering downstairs looking for the Jamaica Ginger, and catches Miss Abigail Ardsley and her ever-loving guy in a clutch that will win the title for any wrestler that can ever learn it. Well, this scene is so repulsive to Miss Abigail Ardsley's papa that he is practically speechless for a minute. And then he orders the young guy out of his life in every respect, and tells him never to darken his door again, especially the side door. But it seems that by this time a great storm is raging outside, and Miss Abigail Ardsley begs and pleads with her papa to let the young guy at least remain until the storm subsides. But between being all sored up at the clutching scene he witnesses and his stomachache, Mr. Ardsley is very hard-hearted indeed. And he makes the young guy take the wind. The next morning, the poor young guy is found at the side door, frozen as stiff as a board. Because it seems that the storm that is raging is the blizzard of 1888. It seems from what Miss Abigail Ardsley says that as near as anyone can make out, the young guy must return to the door seeking shelter after wandering about in the storm a while. But of course, by this time, her papa has the door all bolted up and nobody hears the young guy. And I never speak to my papa again as long as he lives. And no other man ever comes in or out of yonder door, or any other door of this house, until your appearance tonight. Although, she says, this side door is never locked in case such a young man comes seeking shelter. Well, All these old-time memories seem to make Miss Abigail Arley feel very tough. And by she starts to weep. And if there's one thing Lance McGowan cannot stand, it is a doll weeping, even if she is nothing but an old doll. So he starts in to cheer Miss Abigail Arley up, and he pats her on the arm and says to her like this, "Why, I'm greatly surprised to hear your statement about the doors around here being so little used." "Why, sweetheart," Lance says, "if I know there's a doll as good-looking as you in the neighborhood and a door unlocked, I'll be busting in myself every night." Come. Let us talk things over and maybe have a few laughs, because I may have to stick around here for a while. Listen, sweetheart, do you happen to have a drink in the joint?" Well, at this, Miss Abigail Arley dries her eyes and smiles again, and then she pulls a sort of rope near her, and in comes a guy who seems to be about 90 years old, and who seems greatly surprised to see Lance there. In fact, he is so surprised he's practically tottering when he leaves the room after hearing Miss Abigail Arley tell him to bring some wine and sandwiches. And the wine he brings is such wine that Lance McGowan has half a mind to send some of the lads around afterwards to see if there's any more of it in the joint. Especially when he thinks of the unlocked side door, because he can sell this kind of wine by the carat. Well, Lance sits there with Miss Abigail Arley, sipping wine and eating sandwiches, and by, he has her laughing quite heartily indeed. Finally, he figures there's no chance of Angie and the sawdust being outside waiting for him, so he says he guesses he'll be going, and Miss Abigail Arley personally sees him to the door, and this time it is the front door. And as Lance is leaving, he thinks of something he once sees a guy do on the stage, and he takes Miss Abigail Arley's hand and raises it to his lips and gives it a large kiss, which is all very surprising to Miss Abigail Arley, but more so to Lance McGowan when he gets to thinking about it afterwards. So Lance leaves the old doll's house, and just as he imagines, there's nobody in sight when he gets out in the street. So he goes on over to the Hummingbird Club, where he learns that many citizens are greatly disturbed by his absence and are wondering if he's in the louse kid's burlap bag, for by this time, it is pretty well known that Angie the Ox and his fellow citizens of Brooklyn are around and about. In fact, somebody tells Lance that Angie is at this moment over at Good Time Charlie's little speak over on West 49th Street, buying drinks for one and all, and telling how he makes Lance McGowan hop a brick wall, which in fact is pretty disparaging of Lance. Well, while Angie is still buying these drinks and still speaking of making Lance a brick wall hopper, all of a sudden, the door of Good Time Charlie's speak opens, and in comes a guy with a Betsy in his hand. And this guy throws 4 slugs into Angie the Ox before anyone can say hello. Furthermore, the guy throws 1 slug into Mocky Max and 1 slug into the louse kid, who was still with Angie the Ox. So the next thing anybody knows, there's Angie as dead as a doornail, and there's Mocky Max even deader than Angie, and there's the louse making a terrible fuss over a slug in his leg, and nobody can remember what the guy who plugs them looks like, except a couple of stool pigeons who state that the guy looks very much like Lance McGowan. So, what happens? But early the next morning, Johnny Brannigan, the plainclothes copper, puts the arm on Lance McGowan for plugging Angie the Ox and Mocky Max and the louse kid. And there is great rejoicing in copper circles generally, because at this time the newspapers are weighing in the sacks on the coppers quite some, claiming there's too much lawlessness going on around and about, and asking why somebody is not arrested for something. So, the collar of Lance McGowan is water on the wheel of one and all, because Lance is so prominent. And anybody will tell you that it looks as if it's a sure thing that Lance will be very severely punished and maybe sent to the electric chair. Although he hires Judge Goldstein, who's one of the surest-footed lawyers in this town, to defend him. But even Judge Goldstein admits that Lance is in a tough spot, especially as the newspapers are demanding justice and printing long stories about Lance and pictures of him and calling him some very uncouth names. Well, by the time Lance's trial comes up, you can get 3-1 anywhere that he'll be convicted. And the price goes up to 5 when the prosecution gets through with its case and proves by the stool pigeons that at exactly 12 o'clock on the night of January the 5th, Lance McGowan steps into Good Time Charlie's little speak and plugs Angie the Ox and Mocky Max and the Louse Kid. Furthermore, several other witnesses who claim they know Lance McGowan by sight testify that they see Lance in the neighborhood of Good Time Charlie's around 12 o'clock. So by the time it comes Judge Goldstein's turn to put on the defense, many citizens are saying that if he can do no more than beat the chair for Lance, he'll be doing a wonderful job. Well, it is late in the afternoon when Judge Goldstein gets up and looks all around the courtroom. And without making any opening statement to the jury for the defense, as these mouthpieces usually do, he says like this: "Call Miss Abigail Arley." At first, nobody quite realizes just who Judge Goldstein is calling for, although the name sounds familiar to one and all present who read the newspapers. When in comes a little old doll in a black silk dress that almost reaches the floor, and a black bonnet that makes a sort of frame for her white hair and face. Afterwards, I read in one of the newspapers that she looks like she steps down out of an old-fashioned ivory miniature, and that she's practically beautiful. But of course, Miss Abigail Arley has so many potatoes that no newspaper dares to say she looks like an old chromo. Anyway, she comes into the courtroom surrounded by so many old guys, you will think it must be recess at the old men's home. Except they're all dressed up in clawhammer coattails and high collars, and afterwards it turns out that they are the biggest lawyers in this town, and they all represent Miss Abigail Arley one way or another. And they are present to see that her interests are protected, especially from each other. When she takes the witness stand, the lawyers grab chairs and move up as close to her as possible. And in the street outside, there's practically a riot as word goes around. Miss Abigail Arley is in the court, and citizens come running from every which way, hoping to get a peek at the richest old doll in the world. Well, when all hands finally settle down a little, Judge Goldstein speaks to Miss Abigail Arley as follows. "Miss Arley," he says, "I'm going to ask you just 2 or 3 questions. Kindly look at this defendant," Judge Goldstein says, pointing at Lance McGowan. "Is he the caller in your home on the night of January the 5th? Judge Goldstein asks. "He is," Miss Abigail Arley says. "Is there a clock in the living room in which you received this defendant?" Judge Goldstein says. "There is," Miss Abigail Arley says. "A large clock," she says. "Her grandfather's clock." "Do you happen to notice," Judge Goldstein says, "and do you now recall the hour indicated by this clock when the defendant leaves your home?" "Yes," Miss Abigail Arley says. "I do happen to notice. It is just 12 o'clock by my clock," she says. "Exactly 12 o'clock. Well, this statement creates a large sensation in the courtroom. Because if it is 12 o'clock, when Lance McGowan leaves Miss Abigail Arley's house over in West 54th Street, anybody can see there is no way he can be at Good Time Charlie's little speak over 5 blocks away at the same minute. Unless, of course, he is a magician. And the judge begins peeking over his specs at the coppers in the courtroom, very severe. And the cops begin scowling at the stool pigeons. And I'm willing to lay plenty of 6 to 5 that the stools will wish they are never born before they hear the last of this matter from the gendarmes. Furthermore, the guys from the DA's office who are handling the prosecution are looking much embarrassed, and the jurors are muttering to each other, and right away Judge Goldstein says he moves that the case against his client be dismissed. The judge says he's in favor of the motion, And he also says he thinks it's high time the gendarmes in this town learn to be a little careful who they are arresting for murder. And the guys from the DA's office do not seem to be able to think of anything whatever to say. So there's Lance, as free as anybody. And as he starts to leave the courtroom, he stops by Miss Abigail Arley, who is still sitting in the witness chair surrounded by her mouthpieces. And he shakes her hand and thanks her. And while I do not hear it myself, somebody tells me afterwards. Miss Abigail Arley says to Lance in a low voice, like this: "I will be expecting you again some night, young man," she says. "Some night, sweetheart," Lance says. "At 12 o'clock. And then he goes on about his business. Miss Abigail Arley goes on about hers. Everybody says it's certainly a wonderful thing that a doll is rich. As Miss Abigail Arley comes forward in the interest of justice to save a guy like Lance McGowan from a wrong rap. But of course, it is just as well for Lance that Miss Abigail Arley does not explain to the court that when she recovers from the shock of finding her ever-loving young guy frozen to death, she stops all the clocks in her house at the hour she sees him last. So for 45 years, it is always 12 o'clock in her house. Sweet dreams, doll.
Mike McShane narrates Romancing in the Roaring Forties next Saturday night, half an hour earlier, starting at 11 o'clock.